Good morning, everyone. I hope I will get to address in this talk some of the things that have already been raised. So this is trying to capture a bit about what Australia has contributed across previous CMIP rounds. So you've all seen how the CMIP sort of cycle has linked into the IPC cycle. And these are the models that we've submitted at each phase across time. So the Bureau and CSIRO put in separate models in those early phases, CMIP 1 and 2. Since then, we've kind of worked together. And I think one point I just want to make from this is that at each phase, we've put in multiple models. And in general, one of the models would be, I would say, more established, has had a longer history, and some of the others have been more kind of at the front end of our development cycle. So, for example, in the most recent one, we put in both an Earth system model, which was based on a physical climate model that was very similar to the one we'd used in CMIP5. The CM2 model was a climate or physical model only and was more kind of more recent components. So just generally, I wanted to kind of highlight the fact that, you know, the submission to CMIP doesn't kind of stand alone. It is part of this broader development cycle. You know, so we're kind of today, I guess, being part of this design phase. What are the needs, the science directions? What are the feasibility of proposed configurations? There's development work that goes into components of the models. We build it, we put those different components together. There's evaluation that needs to be done. And then, you know, you kind of fix on a configuration that you can then release for wider use with kind of documentation and training. But at each or multiple stages of this, there's the ability to use that model for kind of applications, and whether that's CMIP or other things. There's also probably a bit of an internal loop here where we kind of iterate around this sort of development, building, evaluation stage while we kind of see whether our model is kind of good enough, or, you know, we're happy enough to then sort of release it for wider use. You've seen this diagram on the left a lot of times already this morning. This was the CMIP6 with the sort of deck in the centre. What I've added in here is these black text is the MIPS that we actually participated in. And the ones in italics were the ones where we'd had significant university contributions, or the universities led our participation in those MIPS. We talked about the different types of experiments the CMIP encompasses, so idealized experiments, historical simulations, and view to the future. So the two coupled models that we put in was, as I said, CM2, our climate only model, and ESM, our Earth system model. For us, that means climate plus the carbon cycle. And then ocean only versions that were led out of the Consortium of Ocean and Sea Ice Modelling in Australia, COSIMA. The parts of the model, so each of the couple models is made up of an atmosphere, and air, land, ocean, sea ice components. The bits that I've highlighted here are the ones that are kind of homegrown in Australia. Some of the others we bring in, so the from the atmosphere comes in from the UK Met Office. The ocean is come out of GFDL. The ocean MOM we have a long history of working with. So in each of these, you know, there's various degrees to which Australia will then modify those configurations or develop or adjust those configurations for our use, and perhaps a bit more on the ocean side currently than on the atmosphere side, although some of our Bureau colleagues are working more on, you know, for example, the latest convection schemes in the atmosphere and how they could flow in for use in the Australian region. So I'm often asked this question about, so how much resources does it take to do a CMIP? And of course, then it's kind of like, well, which parts of that model development cycle do you count or not count as needed for CMIP? This is kind of giving you the sort of big, you know, the everything. So that model development being a critical part of the cycle. We reckon at the CSIRO end, it's probably about 10 FTE that we're putting in per year ongoing. And that's spread over about 15 staff, of which some would be what we call affiliates, so students or honorary fellow, that sort of involvement. So as I said, through that development cycle, it is the component model development, the coupling, the model evaluation, setting up the actual input files and running the experiments once you get to what is CMIP itself, post-processing, data management and publishing the model output. And that's, as Ben highlighted, that the role that NCI played in publishing the data was absolutely critical. Kelsey's at the back of the room here, and we ended up doing way more experiments than we initially envisaged, and then that data publication load just flowed onto NCI, and thank you, Kelsey, so much for you and your team doing that. It requires compute and storage. It's all been run on NCI machines. Largely out of CSIRO has a compute share, so 10 to 15 mega service units per quarter. We did at one point, were awarded an Australasian Leadership Computing Grant, hope I've got that acronym right, which gave us about an additional 35 mega service units over about 9 months to a year. And that allowed us, in part to do some of those extra experiments that we hadn't initially sort of envisaged doing. And NCI provided all the storage for publication of the data, and archiving has sort of come back into CSIRO tape storage. Simon mentioned the NEST projects. So prior to the current Climate Systems Hub, the Earth System and Climate Change Hub was supporting the ACCESS work at around sort of 3 FTE per year. And none of this could happen without those sort of collaborations we've had through the ARC Centres of Excellence, originally the Climate System Science, now Climate Extremes. As I said, COSMA 1 and 2 on the Ocean CI side, our UN partnership with the UK Met Office, and now the ACCESS-NRI. What was kind of the impact of our submissions? So these numbers are out of date, but give you the rough order of how many experiments we ran with each model. The number in brackets being the ensemble size. So sometimes you run multiple cases for one experiment, partly to kind of get the sort of spread of response, and partly to sort of find signal amongst climate variability noise in this context. So yes, of order 10,000 and 70,000 model years that was run, this sort of magnitude of terabytes of data that was submitted to the Earth System Grid Federation. And then these download numbers come from the ESGF. Each experiment and each model variable is a separate file, so that's how you kind of end up with these millions of downloads. But the key for us number here is the ranking compared to other modelling groups around the world. So both models are in the top 10 of downloaded models within CMIP6, and ACCESS-ESM, when we last checked, had crept up to 4th. Our 2 papers that describe the 2 model configurations, one led by Dave B, one led by Thilo Zeen. I've listed the citations there because for us, that's kind of a measure of who's using the data, because if people are doing a multi-model study, they will hopefully have cited our paper because we've got our models contributed there. So yes, that's really showing, I think, research uptake. We've talked about the IPCC. We talked about the use in downscaling. So Australian Climate Service, ACS, is using both models for downscaling. But there's statistical downscaling that happens. This is actually a US group who've done it across a whole lot of models. It's out there, the data on some Microsoft storage. Ramona, this talks to your question about impact pathways. Can clearly be fleshed out, but this main one up the top is this impact through to IPC and the Paris Agreement. but trying to kind of get this idea that while the CMIP model output becomes an input for a downscaling impact pathway, the downscaling output becomes an input for a climate projections pathway, and then lots of people use the climate projections, presumably in the adaptation space. And, you can see how what we do at the CMIP end kind of underpins this flow down through different impact pathways. Unfortunately, that's the end of my slides.